John Stuart Mill was one of the great philosophers of the 19th century, and today we're going to take a look at his famous ethical theory called utilitarianism. I love this picture of John Stuart Mill. It shows his intelligence and his intensity. He looks like he's staring laser beams right through you. He was a very passionate and talented man. He actually started out as kind of a child prodigy. At the age of 3, being homeschooled by a very ambitious father, he started to learn ancient Greek, which, if you've ever tried to learn ancient Greek, you know how hard that is. It's harder than most modern languages to learn. At age 7, he was working on classical Latin, and he had 5 younger siblings, and he was homeschooled, and he had to teach everything he learned to those 5 younger siblings once he had learned it. So by the age of 13, John Stuart Mill was better educated than any university graduate of the time. Um, he wrote on a lot of different things. He wrote on logic, theory of knowledge, philosophy of religion. He's well known for being an early proponent of women's suffrage, their right to vote. But today we're going to look at his theory about right and wrong, his theory of normative ethics as expounded in his famous book Utilitarianism, written in 1863. And this book gives a very simple and very, on the face of it, plausible theory. And Mill sort of thinks that the main reason people don't adopt his theory of right and wrong is that they just misunderstand it. So before we go to the theory itself, let's just remind ourselves what a theory of normative ethics is supposed to do. The task of an ethical theory is to say what makes right actions right and what makes wrong actions wrong. And we're not just looking for a rule of thumb, something that holds for the most part. You know, right actions are legal and wrong actions are illegal, or something sloppy like that that would have a lot of obvious exceptions. Or right actions are the ones that your mom told you to do, and wrong actions are the actions that your parents would frown on. It's supposed to be a universal, exceptionless claim. So it's supposed to tell us for any action, whatever, for any actual action or any possible action, A. If and only if something, then A is right. And if and only if something else, then A is wrong. So the task of an ethical theory is to fill in these two blanks, this one and this one. And Mill's theory does that pretty clearly. So let's take a look now at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. There are basically 3 core elements, 3 claims to the theory. First, there's what Mill calls the utility principle. This says that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. That is, they are the only intrinsic goods. So an intrinsic good is something which is sought for its own sake, not for the sake of something else that it leads to. It's opposed to an instrumental good. And what he's saying is the only things that are worth seeking just for their own sake are these 2 things, pleasure and freedom from pain. Anything else that's worth seeking is worth seeking because it leads to one or both of these. So that's the utility principle. Next, there's the greatest happiness principle, also called the consequentialist principle. And in Mill's words, this says, actions are right in proportion as they tend to produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Now, if you know anything about theories of human happiness, you know that there are a lot of them and that they're inconsistent with one another. So when you see the greatest happiness principle in that word, happiness, you should be asking yourself, what is meant by that? Well, happily, Mill tells us what he means by that. That's actually his 3rd principle. He defines happiness as pleasure and the absence of pain, and he defines unhappiness as pain and the absence of pleasure. So insofar as you have those first 2 things, you're happy. Insofar as you have those second two things, you're unhappy. Of course, happiness and unhappiness will come in degrees. Now, probably the core principle here, and the one to really focus on, is this second one. And he thinks that this is a fundamental moral truth. Fundamental moral principle. It's not the only moral principle. There are lots of other moral principles that are true. Um, for instance, you could say, don't vandalize public parks. Don't graffiti your name on the wall and spray paint. Don't add your genius poetry to the bathroom wall. Mill thinks that's a true principle, but the reason why you shouldn't do those things is because of the greatest happiness principle. So this is the more fundamental one. The reason why you shouldn't graffiti or vandalize public parks is because that action on the whole tends to produce unhappiness. You get a little thrill out of it, yes, but other people are annoyed whenever they see it, and it produces a lot more pain than it does pleasure, so that's why it's wrong. Um, Here's a true principle. You shouldn't hit your sister just for the fun of it. You shouldn't punch your little sister just because your parents aren't looking and it's fun to do. Mill would say that's a true moral principle, but again, what makes it true is the greatest happiness principle. Again, if you weigh the happiness and unhappiness that result from that action, you'll see that it produces more unhappiness than happiness. All right, you get a little thrill of doing it, but it hurts your sister, and then it hurts her every time she thinks about it. It may also scare other kids that are watching, cause mental pain in them. So if you add up the happiness and the unhappiness, on the whole, it produces unhappiness, and that's why it's wrong. Or don't cheat on your spouse. Mill was married at one point. He would say that's true, that you ought not cheat on your spouse. But again, it's a true moral principle, but it's not the fundamental moral principle, which is the number two here. So the reason why it's wrong to cheat on your wife is because that action on the whole tends to produce the reverse of happiness. Now you might be thinking of some sort of objection already. If so, that's good. But hang on, we'll get to some objections in a bit. So the greatest happiness principle is supposed to be deeper, and it's supposed to be more fundamental. It's supposed to tell us what makes all right actions right and what makes all wrong actions wrong. Now, Mill, ingeniously in this book, goes through a lot of objections that are really misunderstandings. So it's helpful to go through some objections that are really misunderstandings, because that helps you to get clear about what he is and what he is not saying. First of all, some people stumble at the name utilitarianism, and they stumble over the word utility that's in it, and they think, well, this theory is just saying that what's right is what's practical and what's wrong is impractical. They're thinking the right actions are the ones which have utility or practical usefulness, and the wrong actions are the ones which are impractical. That's just not what he's saying at all. He's saying the right actions are ones which cause happiness, the wrong actions are the ones which cause, on the whole, unhappiness. He does think it's a practical theory, and he was concerned for his whole adult life with different kinds of societal reforms. Yeah, but that's just a crass misunderstanding. Here's an interesting objection that he goes on about at some length. It's the objection that the doctrine is worthy of swine. It's a piggish moral theory. Now, why would somebody say that? Well, because the goal that we're aiming at when we're choosing our actions, the thought is you're just considering pleasure and lack of pain. And that's kind of animalistic, to only consider pleasure and lack of pain. Just like a swine that only cares about rolling in the mud and enjoying his slop and things like that, isn't it unworthy of a rational human being to only consider pleasure and lack of pain? Now, Mill says, no, there's nothing swinish about my doctrine. There's nothing animalistic about it. Look, humans are capable of better kinds of pleasure than pigs are, and the theory takes this into account. So one interesting point that Mill makes in response to this, one interesting clarification, is that there are pleasures of the body, yes, but there are also pleasures of the intellect. Mill says, quote, pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments have a much higher value as pleasures than those of mere sensation. His point is that there are different kinds of pleasures, and that some are more valuable than others. And the kind of pleasures that only humans are capable of, he thinks, are worth more than just pleasures of pretty sights and pretty sounds, or yummy tasting food, sexual pleasure, and things like that. So he's not only talking about lower pleasures, the pleasures that we have in common with animals for food, sex, touch, pretty sights, sounds, and pleasing smells. He's concerned also with pleasures of the pleasure of doing a mathematical problem, or the pleasure of reading a philosophy book and pondering it, or the pleasure of attending a Shakespearean play and appreciating the fine craftsmanship that's gone into the drama. He actually says, quote, it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So he says if you have a small amount of higher pleasures, pleasures of the intellect, moral sentiments, feelings, and imagination, that's better than having a much larger quantity of lower pleasures, like the pleasure of being drunk, or hearing a nice song, or enjoying a bowl full of cereal. And how do we know that the higher pleasures are better? He argues that those who have experienced both higher and lower pleasures say that the higher pleasures outweigh the lower. So his point is that the higher pleasures outweigh equal amounts of the lower pleasures. So yeah, a pig only knows the basic bodily pleasures, and maybe a really stupid person only is familiar with the basic bodily pleasures, but a properly educated person knows the pleasure of eating a tasty bowl of cereal, and he also knows the pleasure of solving algebraic equations, and just considers the one pleasure to be more valuable than the other. So a small amount of a higher pleasure would be better for you than a higher amount of a lower pleasure. It's a very interesting question whether or not that's true.